Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Yevamot, Daf Vav. This week's learning is sponsored by Bracha Ehrman. Mazal Tov to Esther Ehrman, the Beit Shemesh Women's Daf Yomi group, and the Hadran community on finishing Seder Moed. Today's daf is sponsored by Devara Asheim in loving memory of her grandmother, Sarah Pfeffer Asheim. Well, Mama, your sudden passing in Hanover, Germany in 1931 created a void that is still felt to this day. You would be so proud of your descendants. Okay, just a little introduction, just because it was Shabbat and I heard some comments from people about Yevamot, and not that I didn't hear it before, I kind of knew, but maybe I should just give a little bit of an encouragement to those who started Yevamot. Okay, first of all, the beginning of the Masechet is a little bit long-winded and confusing, besides the first Mishnah in and of itself, which was quite confusing, and all the people and who's who and what's what. So I'm going to remind you that we're creating materials for all of Yevamot. Whenever we get to complicated cases, we'll view it graphically. So if you're listening to the podcast and you're not viewing the YouTube, what I recommend is either start learning this time for Yevamot with the YouTube when you can, or alternatively on our site, you can just, while you're listening, you can just open the presentation on your own and look through. Okay, the next presentation is on Daf Tet, there's on Yud, on Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, that's kind of going toward neck down the road. You know, when we need them, we're going to have diagrams that are going to show. It'll be very helpful for you. You can either view it in PDF format. If you're doing PDF though, and you want to see everything moving, you have to have it in the right mode. Otherwise it won't. It's to be like in a read mode or presentation mode so that you can actually see things moving. To use something like Adobe. Okay, so number one, we're here to help you. We have the bookmarks. Okay, we'll open registration again and have another mailing out maybe in a week or so, or we'll start gathering information this week and maybe mail them out next week for those who want to order bookmarks and didn't have, which also just helps you. It keeps terms that are basic, that keep repeating. If you want to know the details of them, they'll be in front of you. Okay, so those are all tools we've been to kind of help you out. And remember that when you're learning Daf Yomi, it's good to learn and understand everything, but once in a while you don't understand everything, you'll learn it because we're going to keep repeating the themes and the concepts, and things will become much easier. And at our past Siyum we just had, there were two different women, one who, if you haven't seen it, Deb Rosen's went up online. That actually happened in person. We recorded it and it went up. She actually did a Siyum Hashas and had started in Yevamot. So if that's encouragement to anyone, that's great. And also you heard, those are the English Siyum, heard Suri Davis Stern, who started in the middle of Yevamot, is nearing her end of the Siyum Hashas and also love Yevamot. You just have to get into it. It takes some time, but you'll get there, not to worry. Okay, we're going to now start. I'm going to do a little bit of review again, just to kind of get us up to where we're up to, because this sugya was kind of long-winded. In the beginning of Masechtot, by the way, many times the sugyot are a different style of sugya. It's called stamai. It's from the later time, after the Amoraim time period. There were stamaim. They don't have names usually, and that's why they're called stamaim. And they ask different style questions of the Gemara, and sometimes they're a little bit long-winded, or more long-winded than others. In fact, I'm very known there's a Facebook group called Yomi. It's a Hebrew Facebook group with a bit of more of an academic orientation. And she showed there very nicely how Yevamot, the beginning of Yevamot, parallels exactly the beginning of Kiddushin. It helped explain some difficulties and things that were confusing a little bit, like the Chamesh Esrei, there's number before, there's number after. She said that really matches more Kiddushin, where there's a number at the end, and we had to explain what did that mean exactly. Anyway, she explains how they're both Sfarim, and the one was modeled after the other. Probably Yevamot was modeled after Kiddushin, so we'll keep that in mind when we get to Kiddushin. In any case, where we got to was this drasha we took this drasha about Achot Isha. We tried to learn where do all these laws come from in the Mishnah, that not only, right, when somebody is supposed to do Yibum with someone who's forbidden to them from one of the arayot in the Torah, one of the forbidden relationships, what we learned is, even though Yibum itself is a forbidden relationship, right? But anything other than your brother's wife, which is allowed in Yibum because the Torah specifically says you're supposed to marry your brother's wife, even though normally you're not, any of the other forbidden relationships, not only do you not do Yibum, you're also exempt, so you don't do Chalitza either, okay? So if it's supposed to be someone that's a forbidden relationship, you don't do Yibum at all. Where is that learned from? Achot Isha, from the case of a man whose brother was married to a woman, and that woman, now you can't marry, the man can't marry her sister either. And there it said, Aleha bechayeha, right? It said, Lo tikach litzror et achota litzror, legalot ervata aleha bechayeha. on her in her life. Why aleha? From there, we learn to Yibum, where it says Yevama yavo aleha. The Yabam is supposed to have relations with the Yevama, right? They're supposed to enter into marriage together. And there it says aleha, since that's in time of mitzvah. Also, the forbidden relationship is even b'makom mitzvah. From there, we learn Yibum doesn't override arayot. To which the Gemara said, well, what's the premise? The premise is without the drasha, you would have thought Yibum does override. So now, why would Yibum override? Because mitzvah aseh, dochel ot aseh, and even when there's karet. So that got the Gemara off on a big question. Number one, even though it was number two question, we're going to say number one because it was the number one question they answered, was the first question they answered. Number one, how do we know that a mitzvah aseh can override a regular mitzvah lo taseh? And for that, we proved it from tzitzit, either Rabbi Yishmael who had semer ufishtin as unnecessary words, because every cloth, every clothing is generally made of wool or linen, and therefore it didn't need to say wool or linen by shatnez, where you can't mix two types. That pasuk was juxtaposed to tzitzit. From there, you learn that tzitzit overrides. Or the word shatnez, which is a very strange word. So even though they learned some things from it, they could still learn other things from it. And in the end, according to the rabbis who think that semer and fishtin was necessary, because not every beged is semer and fishtin, and the halach of shatnez is specifically wool and linen, they learn it from the word shatnez, which was unnecessary. That's what teaches you that comes, once you have an unnecessary word, you can darshan smuchim, what we say, right? Juxtaposition. That was easy, okay? Or if somebody, it took us a while to get there. Now we're going to still be struggling to find, how do you know that even when there's karet involved, that the mitzvah aseh is going to override? And from there, we tried in yesterday's daf to come up with a bunch of options, okay? And I charted them all out in the sheet today. So it was Brit Milah, it was Pesach, Korban Tamid, it was some combination of the two. I listed all the combinations on the chart and what the rejections were of each of them. And the last one we got to was Kibbud Avayim. So we're going to start there today. And that will be our, okay, that hopefully got you kind of caught up to where we are now to understand what we're doing. So the bottom of Hamlet, they say, let's learn it from Kibbud Avayim. Why? Again, it's going to be the same logic as before. We started with this Achot Isha. We said there's a drasha. Now, we're not for the drasha. What would be the simple reading? The simple reading would be Yibum would override the mitzvah lo taseh. Right? And that was our whole question. Where do we get that from? So we're going to do the same thing with all the next answers, okay? Where we're going to basically say there's a special drasha to say it doesn't override, which implies that in every other case it overrides. And what's a little bit crazy about this theory, each time we're going to say it, is that we're then going to say this is going to be a paradigm for all other cases. But it's funny because it's a paradigm where it doesn't override. But what we're saying is it doesn't override because of a special drasha. And therefore, we're going to assume if it were not for the drasha, it would override. And that's where we learn it for everything else. It's a little bit difficult because we're basically saying this creates a paradigm when this actually breaks the rule of the paradigm. But that's their logic. So again, I'm going to start now 6 lines from the bottom just to kind of get you into, right, to not start mid-sentence. You would have thought, you would, again, what's itzrich? You need the drasha aleha, because were it not for the drasha aleha, you would have thought that it would override. Why would it override? From the mitzvah of honoring your parents. Tanya, right? This is a great question in general, which is, what if your parents tell you to do something wrong? Are you allowed to do it? On one hand, you're commanded to respect your parents and do whatever they say. On the other hand, you're also commanded to do mitzvot. So what happens when they conflict? So what if they tell you, cook me some food on Shabbat, right? Which we're going to assume this means. You're supposed to fear your parents and keep Shabbat. What do those two things have to do with in the same pasuk? Two totally different things. It's to say that both your mother and your father are also commanded to respect me. And therefore, if your parents tell you not to keep Shabbat, well, you have to keep it anyway. So what do you see here? We assume you mean that the parents said, cook me food, slaughter me an animal, which is forbidden with, right, punishable by karet. And the reason why this is all is because, right, the reason why we say that you're not allowed to do that is because it says, if it didn't have that, it would override. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Who's to say this is karet? There's things you can't do on Shabbat that are just forbidden, not by karet, not punishable by karet, like mechamer. What's mechamer? Leading an animal, right? The animal has a load on it and you're leading the animal. You're not actually doing anything yourself. So you don't get karet for that, but it is forbidden. And maybe it's talking about that, in which case this doesn't teach you anything about karet. So now the Gemara is going to say, okay, if you want to say it's lav de mechamer, we're going to have a problem with that. In which case we're going to reject this. Okay, what's their problem? Well, afilu hachi lo dache. So now you're going to say, now they're doing the reverse logic of what they said before, which is, if we say that there's a drasha in this pasuk, which is telling you the mitzvah aseh of kibud av v'em doesn't override a regular lo taseh of mechamer, okay, on Shabbat, well then, ela dekaimalan, we already learned that ate aseh v'dacha lo taseh, ligmor behacha de lo lidche. Well, now we have two parallel things. We have tzitzit and shatnes, which teach you aseh docha lo taseh. We now have kibud av v'em and Shabbat, which teach you, again, assuming we're talking about mechamer, and they're both equal, they're both the same kind of situation. One teaches you that the mitzvah aseh, the positive commandment, overrides, and the other one teaches you the positive commandment doesn't override. So maybe we should use the mechamer, the kibud av v'em, as the paradigm, and we don't. So in other words, if you're going to assume it's a regular negative commandment, then this could be the paradigm for the whole law, and we could learn the exact opposite. Now, we know that's not the case. So that's why it's a question. If you're going to say, and as if you're going to fill in and say it's not karet, in which case it would be teaching us something else, and it's teaching the exact opposite of what the previous drasha taught us. The chi tema, now you might say, and then, so ligmor mehacha de lo lidche, we should learn from here to all other cases that positive commandments never override negative commandments. So now is a possible answer to that, to keep this as lav de mechamer, in which case this has nothing to do with karet. If you want to say shane lave de Shabbat chamire, you can learn from here because Shabbat in general is very stringent. So maybe that's why it doesn't override Shabbat. So that would mean, according to this, kibud av v'em doesn't override Shabbat, but then maybe it would override other mitzvot. In other words, maybe if your parents tell you to do something else forbidden, you could do it, right? They told you, I don't know, go steal. You could steal maybe because it's not as severe as Shabbat. And maybe the reason why this doesn't create a paradigm and tell you all mitzvot aseh don't override the lo taseh is because it's just relating to Shabbat. But that's not true. The Braita mentions all sorts of issues here that you can't listen to your parents when they tell you to do some sort of transgression. Ditanya, where do we see this? Here, right? And nobody, if lo kaparech means nobody rejects that. Everyone agrees with that. So let's read it. Ditanya, yachol amar lo aviv hitameh. Let's say you're a Kohen or a Nazir, and your father says, go into the cemetery, which you're not allowed to do. Oh, sha'amar lo al tachzil, or you found a lost item, and your father or mother tells you, don't return it. Okay? Yachol yishmalo, maybe you have to listen to them because positive commandment of mitzvah kibud av v'em. Talmud lamav, ishimo v'aviv tirao v'et shabtotai tishmoru, kulchem chayavim b'chvodi. So here you see, this overrides everything, even not only Shabbat, in which case we're back to square one. Well, not square one, but square two, or right, which was, if you want to assume this is mechamer and this has nothing to do with karet, well, then this should be a paradigm to teach you mitzvah aseh don't override lo taseh, and we know that's not the case. In which case they want to go back to say it must be karet, and then you could learn from here. So now the Gemara says, Ela mishum de'ika lemifrach. I'm going to already tell you right now, I'm going to explain this the way Rashi explains it, but a lot of people take issue with Rashi on this, and there's other explanations. Some people think that this is a continuation of the mechamer discussion within mechamer, okay, and they understand this totally differently. I'm not going to explain the Gemara this time two different ways. I'm just going to tell you there's another way to understand this, to read this, but I'm going to explain it like Rashi, which is, we're back to square one. We're back to, at this point, mechamer didn't work out because of mechamer really, if we really say that in this drasha, shabtotai tishmoru means only a regular lo taseh, then it should have created a paradigm and taught us that no mitzvah aseh, no positive commandments override negative ones, in which case we're back to saying maybe we can learn from here that a mitzvah aseh does override a negative commandment when it's karet, and only here, because there's a drasha, it's unique, and that's why it defies the rule, but it really, you could learn from here the rule. Well, the Gemara rejects this and says, this isn't like Yibum. Why? Even within Rashi, I'm just going to tell you, there's different explanations what this means, because the term hechsher mitzvah is a little bit used differently than it normally is here. But you might have thought That, you could question that logic and say, this is hechsher mitzvah. Okay, what does it mean this is hechsher mitzvah? So when you do the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em, and you go cook on Shabbos, which is the one we were discussing. So kibbud av va'em, okay, how are you doing the mitzvah? You're cooking food for your parent. That's fulfillment of the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em. And the only way you can do that is by being mechalel Shabbat, right? Desecrating Shabbat. There's no other way to do it, okay? Right? It's when the two things clash entirely. There's no way of getting out of it. If you're going to try to do kibbud av va'em by cooking the food, you can't do it without being mechalel Shabbat. That's what it means, hechsher mitzvah. Again, it's not usually the way we use hechsher mitzvah, which is why people take issue with Rashi. But what it means here is there's no way to do it without transgressing the punishment. Yibum is different. Why is Yibum different? Let's go back to our case, okay? A man has a brother. Let's say two brothers married to two sisters. One husband dies without children. The sister now falls to Yibum, meaning she's supposed to do Yibum with the brother. Now what happens? The brother can't marry two wives, so we say that woman's exempt. But if we try to apply what we just said about Shabbat and kibbud av va'em, we said there's no other way to do it without transgressing. However, in this case, there is a way to do it without transgressing. Why? What could you do? What's the issue? The issue is she's supposed to marry the brother, and the brother can't marry her because he's married to her sister, and that's forbidden. But there's a way out with Yibum. The brother could just do chalitza, right? He could say, I'm not going to marry you. No, I'm not going to marry you. It was often because I'm not going to marry you because I don't want to, or she doesn't want to. But in this case, it's, all right, I can't, so let's just do chalitza. But the law is you don't even have to do chalitza. So it's not a case where in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you have to do Yibum. Now, here's a big question about, is Yibum considered the fulfillment of a mitzvah? Is chalitza considered fulfillment of the mitzvah? Most people say Yibum, chalitza is not a fulfillment of the mitzvah, but it is a way to get out of the mitzvah. In any case, what you see here is there's a different way to do it. So maybe you would think you wouldn't be exempt there. Okay. And that's why you can't learn from here to Yibum and to other things that are like Yibum. Okay. And it would only teach you about hechsher mitzvah, and that won't help us in our situation, because in our situation, there is a way to do it without actually transgressing the man sleeping with his wife's sister. Okay. So that's the explanation. If that whole structure wasn't 100% clear to you, we're going to repeat it now with the next answer. Okay. So basically at this point, where are we? We tried to say we could learn from kibbud av va'em that doesn't override Shabbat, but only doesn't override Shabbat because of a drasha. Were it not for the drasha, it would, and Shabbat is karet. We tried to say maybe it's not karet, maybe it's mechamer. We rejected that, because if that's the case, we would build a new paradigm and we'd come to a different conclusion about a regular lo taseh, that it doesn't override. In the end, we tried to say maybe it is about Shabbat, karet, but then we say, no, it's different, because in Yibum, there's some other way to do it that's not necessarily to transgress, and maybe then you wouldn't learn from here to there. So now we're going to bring the next option. And again, like I said, we're going to have the exact same structure here. Maybe you could learn it from the mitzvah to build the Beit HaMikdash. Why? Titania, and here we're going to have a very similar verse to the one we just had with kibbud av va'em. You might have thought maybe you could build the Beit HaMikdash on Shabbat because it's such an important mitzvah. Talmud Lamal, et Shabtotai tishmoru. Okay, the same thing, right? Shabtotai tishmoru. Ve'et mikdashi tira'u. You should keep Shabbat and fear the temple. Okay? So now, what do we learn from here? Kulchem chayavim b'chvodi. In the end, it's Shmirat Shabbat that's more important than everything. So now, Maila bibonevis sotil. Again, they're going to say the same thing. Here we have a drasha that tells you, on the one hand, you have to build the temple. On the other hand, respect for God is more important. So because of that, what are we going to say? You see here that without the drasha, it would have overridden Shabbat. And Shabbat, what do we mean? We mean like building, right? That's what we're talking about, building the temple. Boneh, soter, right? When you build, you always have to knock down before you build. That's always the first stage of building. So that would include boneh, it would include soter, which are all melachot from the Torah that have karet associated with them. So there you have it. Without the drasha, we would have assumed the aseh of building the Beit HaMikdash would override the lo taseh that has karet. And there's our proof. To which the Gemara says, right? So again, the reason why it is because it says, Al Shabtotai Tishmo, Hai Lav Hachi Dache. But were it not for this, it would override it. So the Gemara says, same as before, Lo Lav de Mechamil. What they mean here is when you build a temple, what else do you have to do? You have to bring the stones to build it with. You have to bring all the equipment. How are you going to bring it? Ride it on an animal and ride the animal to the temple, which again, leading the animal to the temple is not karet. And maybe that's what it means. And then it wouldn't teach you anything about karet. To which again, they're going to say exact same as we did before. So if that's the case, but we know there's this mitzvah that aseh is dochalot aseh. But if we have this drasha that teaches you the mitzvah aseh b'nyan Beit HaMikdash does not override the lav of Shabbat, right? A regular lo taseh of Shabbat. Maybe we should use this as our paradigm to teach that nothing overrides, right? And the chitem, and if you want to say, oh no, this is unique because it's so stringent, Shabbat in general. We already know that the Tana already included, right? When it came to respect for your parents, it already told you that Shabbat is no different from anything else, in which case they're going to bring that same braita. If your father tells you go into a cemetery when you're a Kohen and you can't, or it says, go, don't return this lost item, they tell you. You might have thought you're supposed to listen. The same concept of all have to revere God. That is used only, right? That's used not only in Shabbat, it's used across the board, in which case you can't say this is unique to Shabbat, in which case, if you really want to say it's a regular lo taseh, this should build the paradigm as opposed to tzitzit, which basically says the opposite, in which case this doesn't make sense. Because again, if you fill in to this braita, it was mechamer they were talking about and not karet, then you come to a very different conclusion about these positive commandments overriding negative ones. So therefore, back to square one, again, according to Rashi's reading, again, the only way to build a temple is while you're building the temple is you're doing a prohibited action on Shabbat, because we're back to that it's bona and sotel. There's no other way to do it other than that. Whereas with Yibum, there is some way out. You could do chalitza. And then again, you're in great shape, right? You did chalitza. You were able to fulfill the undoing of the mitzvah of Yibum. You could basically, fulfill your obligation through chalitza, which wouldn't create any prohibition whatsoever, because she didn't marry the husband, the man she wasn't allowed to marry, and all is well. So maybe, right, it would this would override the arayot, and yet it doesn't. So again, right, and this is, you would have thought without the drasha valat, you would have thought. So now they say, okay, now the last sugya ended here, but this one goes farther and says, inachinami, I skipped the line. If this whole drasha is coming to teach you, again, it's talking about Shabbat, which is karet, building and all that. And it's coming to teach you that when it comes to hechsher mitzvah, when there's no other way to do it, it's not going to override, right? The mitzvah aseh won't override the mitzvah lo taseh, but maybe in other cases it would. But we already learned that from kibbud av va'em. So there's no point for that. To which the Gemara says, inachinami, you're right. It really is unnecessary. To which the Gemara says, well, you know what? We were mistaken. This Shabtotai Tishmoru u'mikdashi tirau has nothing to do with our situation whatsoever. And now we're going to get off on a total tangent as to what do we learn from this verse? This verse doesn't teach us that Binyan Beit HaMikdash doesn't override Shabbat. Okay, we know that already from Kibbud av va'em. Okay, once Kibbud av va'em doesn't override the mitzvah of Shabbat, also Binyan Beit HaMikdash wouldn't, because they're both hechsher mitzvah. It's both the same thing. However, it's needed for a different drasha entirely. And this is a very interesting topic in and of itself. So again, so inachinami, in which case, right, you really could learn it from the previous, which means, so what do you need that pasuk for? In other words, again, it's a strange thing to put together. I mean, lots of drashot have been said about this, the Mikdash and Shabbat and the connection, Kedushat Asman, Kedushat Makom. I'm not going to get into that, but from a simple reading of the verse, why are these two things in the same verse? To which they say, we needed to teach you the following thing. You might have thought that you're actually supposed to fear the temple. These are people who take a building a little bit too seriously, right? They look at the Mikdash as if almost like a deity, okay? And they worship it. And that's what we want to avoid. Talmud lomar, et shabtotai tishmoru ve'et mikdashi tirau. What does this pasuk teach you? Ne'emra shmira b'shabbat ve'ne'emra mo'ah b'mikdash. This pasuk compares keeping Shabbat and fear of the temple. What do you learn from that comparison? Ma shmira ha'amura b'shabbat, just like shmira on Shabbat, turning out Amud Bet, lo mishabbat atam mityareh. You're not supposed to revere the day of Shabbat itself. It's not the day. We don't worship a day. We worship when we keep Shabbat. We're basically worshiping God who commanded us to keep Shabbat. This is always the big fear of building a temple, right? That people will take the building too seriously. And it's not about the building. It's about God, right? So that's the halacha that we learn from Et Mikdashi Tirau Et Shabtotai Tishmoru Mikdashi Tirau. That's what we learn from there. Now they want you to know, okay, well, how do you fulfill Morah HaMikdash? Ezohi Morah HaMikdash. What does it mean then to fear the building? So the fear of the temple. Lo yikanes adam b'har habayit b'maklo b'minalo b'pundato b'avach sha'al raglav. We learned this already in Shkalim. We learned it in other places. You shouldn't walk into the temple with your stick, with your shoes, right? You have to take your shoes off when you go into the temple. Bipundato, with your cloak, right? That was this concern. People will steal money, put it under their hem. Uba'avak sha'al raglav, with the dust on your feet, right? You have to come in clean. V'lo ya'asenu kapandaria, you can't make it a shortcut. Okay, I believe this was also in Brachot. Urekika mikava chomer, and you can't spit there. That we learn from a kava chomer. Okay, that's kind of like saying it's obvious. You shouldn't spit there. But that would be really disrespectful. Now we get to another very interesting halacha, which is the way people now, if you go to the Temple Mount, right, there's all these rules of what you have to do halachically, and you can't go to where the Kodesh Kodeshim was. That's all based on what we're going to learn right now. So that's only when there's actually a temple, right? How do we know? So that's all when the temple is standing. But how do we know that this is still applicable when there's no temple standing? Talmud lomar, et shabtotai tishmoru umikdashi tirau. Ma shmira ha'amura b'shabbat la'olam, af mora amura b'mikdash la'olam. We make a second comparison. Just like Shabbat is forever, right? Every 7 days, we're going to keep Shabbat forever. It doesn't end. It's not based on temple or anything else. Likewise, fear of the temple will be forever. So we have to forever. Now, this, by the way, is based on, there's a debate about whether the sanctification of the temple was Kedusha Rishona Kidsha L'Sha'ata V'La'atid Lavo, that once when God's presence rested the first time in the temple, was that forever or was it not? And is it only right when the temple is there? So there's a debate about this. This obviously follows that the sanctity is there forever, and therefore you have to still treat it with kavod. Why did we get to this? Remember, this was all to say that Binyan Beit HaMikdash has nothing to do with aseh doche lo taseh. The juxtaposition of Shabbat to Mikdash teaches us two other halachot entirely. Number one, don't treat the temple like it's a deity, but right, it's really just fear of God, and that's why we have fear of the temple, just like Shabbat. And secondly, just like Shabbat is forever, also fear of the temple is forever, even when there's no temple. In which case, this had nothing to do with our topic, and we're back to square one. So we're still trying to find a reason for how do we know that a mitzvah, aseh, a positive commandment, can override a negative commandment that has karet associated with it. So our next option, Tana debe Rabbi Yishmael, okay, depending on how you count this, you count it as seventh answer, okay, because we have Mila, Pesach, Tamid. Then I counted all as one, all the options of Mila and Pesach and Tamid and all that. Let's just count it as one. Then we went to Kibbutz Avayim, we went to Binyan Beit HaMikdash, and now we're going to kindling on Shabbat. Okay, kindling on Shabbat is a whole interesting topic. We've seen this Gemara also a bunch of times, part of it. kindling, the 39 malachot of Shabbat are not mentioned in the Torah explicitly at all. Okay, it says, don't do malacha, don't do malacha, don't do malacha. Okay, there's all different ways they get to the number 39. It says malacha 39 times, even though it says it more. Anyway, that's a whole topic in and of itself. But there's one malacha that's mentioned specifically, and that's lo tevaru esh b'chomash potechem. Okay, there's also something about hotza'ah. Well, that's a whole separate thing, but basically we're going to focus on this lo tevaru esh. So now the Gemara says, Elasalkadatach amina teitime havara. Maybe you could suggest that they learn it from havara. Why? Ditana debei Rabbi Yishmael, in the house of Rabbi Yishmael, which really means the school of Rabbi Yishmael, they have the following bright. Lo tevaru esh b'chomash votechem. Matamu lamar. What do we learn from this pasuk? Don't kindle a fire in all the places that you live. So the Braita asks, what do we learn from here? To which the Gemara immediately stops the Braita and says, what kind of a question is this? We know the answer to this question. We've learned it elsewhere. So we're cutting off the Braita in the middle and saying, Matamu lamar, what do you mean? Ila Rabbi Yossi lalat. Ila Rabbi Natan l'chalek. This is a very basic machloket. We learned it way back when in Shabbat. We've seen this a bunch of times, which is, Havara, according to Rabbi Yossi, there's a machloket about why it stands out, why it was mentioned specifically. Rabbi Yossi says, it was said specifically because lighting a fire is not the same thing as a malacha, right? You light a match or you, right, take two rocks together, create a fire. That's not the usual, it's not work. It's not like sewing or planting, okay? It's a very simple thing. And it's not, therefore, going to have the severity as other melachot of Shabbat. So it's written there to tell you all other melachot of Shabbat, you get stoned if you do them on purpose with edim and with warning and all that and witnesses. And if not, you get karet. And if you do them accidentally, you have to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering. But this one specifically is different. It's just a regular lo taseh, okay? That's what it comes for. Again, we're totally off topic now because we're trying to bring havara. We're trying to bring a drasha in it. And the Gemara says, why are you trying to darshan these words as if they're unnecessary? They're very necessary. And we have a basic machloket about it somewhere else. So Rabbi Yossi says it was distinguished. It came to be mentioned specifically for what reason? To distinguish it from all the other melachot. This one melacha is a lo taseh. All the others, skila, karet, either Rabbi Natan, according to Rabbi Natan, no, it's the same as all the others. So why was it singled out? Lichalek. It was singled out to create a paradigm for all of them, which is to say that even though there's 39 melachot, if you do an action that involves a bunch of different melachot and you did it accidentally and you're going to have to bring a sin offering, you're going to have to bring a separate sin offering for every single melacha that you did. Okay, let's say you didn't remember it was Shabbat and you did something that involved a bunch of different melachot. You'd have to bring, it's not like, okay, one thing you did wrong, you were mechalel Shabbat. Okay, I didn't know it was Shabbat today, or I didn't know these melachot were forbidden, and I just did that. No, you'd have to bring a separate sin offering for every single av melacha. So for there, that's what we learned from. It's specified one to use it as a paradigm. So back to our question, okay? And now we're going to first prove. How do we know that Rabbi Yossi says it's a lav and Rabbi Natan l'chalek? We're just going to prove bring the bright to where it says it. Ditanya havar lelav yatzta. Okay, right? It was yatzta means it was taken out from the klal of komalacha lotasu komalacha. It was singled out for what reason? To tell you it's a lotas divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Natan amar lechalek. Okay, that's the machlok. In which case, what's this Braita talking about? When it says, why do we need that pasuk? We already know why we need that pasuk, depending on who you are, either this or that, but we have answers for that. So amarava, you misunderstood the Braita. They're not talking about the words lo tevaru esh, tana moshavot kakashela. What's difficult to the Tana here is why does it say b'chomash votechem? And now you'll see why. Moshavot matom lomar. Michdi Shabbat chovat hagufu. Would you have thought that Shabbat depends? What is b'chomash votechem? It means wherever you're living. It means, basically, in the words of the Torah, not only in Israel. We know there's what we call mitzvot liot ba'aretz, things that only happen in the land of Israel. And then we have things that are b'chomash votechem wherever you live. Now, if I asked you Shabbat, would you have to keep that only in Israel? Nobody would think that. Of course not. This has nothing to do with Israel whatsoever. So that's the question. Because Shabbat is chovat hagufu, it's on the person. Chovat haguf hi. The chovat haguf doheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Right? If it's on you, right? Do we say, oh, you only can't steal in Israel? No, of course not. You can't steal anywhere. Shabbat also anywhere. Mishum Rabbi Yishmael, Amar Talmid Achad. So now we're going to understand why is Moshavot there. Here comes the answer of the Braita. So we're back into the Braita. Lefi shene'emar v'chiyeh be'ish chet mishpat mavet v'humat. Now on a topic of when the Beit Din is told to kill somebody because they did, so let's say somebody murders someone, that person's supposed to be killed. It says when you have ish chet mishpat mavet v'humat and he is killed, Shomeh, and then it's about hanging it and how long you leave the body out. Shomeh ani bein b'chol bein b'shabbat. V'humat sounds like he's killed no matter what. Whether, let's say it was found out and determined and it's Shabbat now. Let's say you didn't kill him Friday afternoon. There wasn't enough time. So you kill him on Shabbat. It overrides Shabbat, even though you're not allowed to kill on Shabbat. And you're not allowed to kill at all. But when it's the Beit Din, you're allowed to kill. But maybe you could do it on Shabbat. But in a different verse, it talks about Shabbat. It says anyone who disgraces Shabbat will be killed. Then you would have to say, that's everything else other than when the Beit Din is commanded. Because why? Again, this is our question. This is a question in the Braita, but what would we conclude if we say this? In a minute, we're going to give option number 2. But option number 1 is the mitzvah of killing someone who's deserving of death by the court would override Shabbat, which has karet, and then we'd have our example. That's the example we're trying to bring, right? This was all we got kind of sidetracked. But Havara will be coming to teach you that even though Havara is forbidden, you can do it, right, when it comes to Mita Beit Din. So hold off for a minute. O Eno Ella, or maybe Afilu Mita Beit Din. Maybe Mechalale Hamot Yumat is even the court can't disgrace Shabbat to kill someone who's deserving of death. Umani Mekayem Behumat. So when it says Behumat and he gets killed, what would you say there? Bechol v'lo b'Shabbat. You'd say that's only on a weekday and not on Shabbat. Right? You limit that pasuk instead of limiting Mechalale Hamot Yumat. So there are 2 possibilities. Oh, I know Ella b'Shabbat, or maybe Behumat means Shabbat. That's just going back to the first option. Talmud Lamal, Lo tivaru esh b'chomosh votechem. Okay, it says, don't light a fire b'chomosh votechem. Ulahalanu omer, v'hayu ele lachem lechukat mishpat ledorotechem b'chomosh votechem. Hayu ele is in a list of where it's talking about killing people in the court. It says it's really talking about all different kinds of murders and things like that. And then it says, this is all for you, mishpat ledorotechem b'chomosh votechem. Now, what do you see here? Mosh votechem appears there about the court and killing people. And mosh votechem appears by lo tivaru esh. Ma moshavot ha'omrim halam bebeit din, af moshavot ha'omrim kan bebeit din. What does that say? This is exactly the Yibum pasuk. Just like Yibum was Makom Mitzvah because it said Allah. Also, the woman was Makom Mitzvah. It says Allah, and it says don't marry her. So you can't marry her even when there's Yibum. Likewise here, Moshavot means right in the Beit Din in one place. Therefore, when it says Lo tivaru esh b'chomosh votechem, it means even in the Beit Din. And what does it say? V'amar Rachmana lo tivaru. You can't light. You can't kindle a fire. Now, what kindling a fire goes on with Mita Beit Din? Sreifa. With Sreifa, what do? They use hot lead. That's how they burned people. They would pour hot lead down their throat. We'll get to all the gory details in Sanhedrin. I'm sure you'll love to hear that. But they heat it up. They need to heat it up. They need to light a fire. So there it tells you can't light a fire in order to do the Mita Beit Din. So what do you see here? Without the drasha of Moshavot, this was all, remember we started with this drasha of, what do we learn from the words Lo tivaru esh b'chomosh votechem? First we said, well, it's not on the word Lo tivaru esh because that we already darshaned, either lalav or lachalek. Now we say, why does it say b'chomosh v'techem? To teach them, you can't kindle a fire even in the court, even if the court needs to institute Mita Beit Din, which means there's a special drasha, which means what? Again, back to square one. When there's no special drasha, if we didn't have a drasha, what would we assume? That you would be able to. Why would we assume that? Because ate ase v'dache lo taseh, that has karet. And there we have our answer, but that's only if, okay, if you say lo tivaru esh is, and now you know, this is another reason why we brought up Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Natan, my love Rabbi Natan, he damar lechalek yatzta, which means it's karet. You'd have to say lo tivaru is karet because that's what we're looking for. V'tama dekata rachmana, now we're just explaining what I said already. The reason why the Torah said lo tivaru esh was to teach you that you can't do it, but halav hach, if you didn't have that drasha moshvot, then it would be doche. And that's only though if you hold by Rabbi Natan. So of course the Gemara rejects and says, what do you mean Rabbi Natan? Lo, Rabbi Yossi. You could say the whole thing is Rabbi Yossi. It's only a regular lo taseh. It doesn't teach you anything about karet. We're basically having repeat arguments that we had from the beginning of the daf. Right? Every time we tried to say, is it Shabbat that it was karet? Oh no, maybe it was mechamer that wasn't karet. Here we could say also, oh, maybe you just don't view the Tavaru Esh as karet, and that's why it doesn't override. So now, right, then it would override. Sorry. It doesn't override, even though it normally would, right? If it weren't for drasha, it would have overridden, but then it would just override a regular lo taseh and not karet. But then they have a question here. They say, wait a minute. Tahavinami Rabbi Yossi, even if you say Rabbi Yossi, you could still get to karet. Why? Imor da'amar Rabbi Yossi havara lelav yatzat havara great data. What did Rabbi Yossi mean when he said havara? He meant like creating a fire, right? Lighting a fire. Nowadays, it would be striking a match. But that he would say is a lo taseh. But what do they do with the fire in the temple here or in the Beit Din, in the court? They heat up lead. Now, heating is like cooking. And that's one of the melachot. Why? Because they used to cook in the time of the Mishkan. They would cook up the dye for the wool or for whatever they were dyeing in the temple, right? All the curtains and everything. So, havara debating bishul ptilahu. Mali bishul ptilah, mali bishul sammanim. The cooking that we're talking about, the fire here, yes, it's true, you light the fire, but really what you do is you're heating up the lead. And even Rabbi Yossi will agree, that's a malachami deoraita that has karet involved. That's a karet issue. So we're now at a place where we now have an answer. Don't worry, we're going to reject it. But we now have an answer, which is the aseh of killing someone in a court, were it not for the drasha, would have overridden the cooking of the heating up of the lead on Shabbat, which is karet, and there we have an answer. But Amar of Shimi Bar Ashi, a different type of rejection now than before. This is not because, were it not for the drasha, you would have thought it overrides, is not because of the principle that we're trying to look for, which is comes in aseh and overrides a lo taseh that has karet. No, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait more for tomorrow to understand this properly. You would have learned it out from a kal v'chomer argument. Okay, right? Kal v'chomer argument. We know, right? If in an easy situation, it's going to do this, then all the more so in a more severe situation. Okay, now they're going to start explaining it, but we're going to get into it tomorrow. I could go a little bit farther, but it won't help you. It's going to get all explained tomorrow in much more detail. But the principle is like this. Right? When it says if you desecrate Shabbat, I would have thought that it applies to all kinds of melachot you do, but not when the court has to kill somebody. Maybe that you could do on Shabbat. Why? Okay. Aval mita beitin is different. Why? Dachya Shabbat mi kal v'chomer. We would have been able to use a kal v'chomer argument to say that we would have thought that the beitin implementing this punishment would override Shabbat, okay? And that they'd be able to do it on Shabbat, not because we have this principle that a mitzvah aseh overrides a mitzvah lo taseh, even when there's karet. Not for that reason, but because of a kal v'chomer argument, which we will see in tomorrow's daf. So wishing everybody a Shavua Tov. And again, this daf is very simple, even though we got into a lot of long-winded arguments, but the basic structure is very clear, which is we gave a number of different explanations. I counted them as 7. You could count them a little differently. In the chart, you could see I listed each one separately, so it's even more the combo of Tamid and Shabbat, of Pesach and all that. But basically from yesterday to today, right, from the end of yesterday's daf to today, we basically went through 7 different options to try to come up with why we know that an aseh is dachai lo taseh when there's karet involved, and each one got rejected for its own reason. Okay, some for the same reason and some for different reasons. And like I said, there's a review in the chart, and you can use the study guide in general to help you. And we will move on tomorrow and see if we get to an answer about this. So wishing everyone a Shavua Tov.